He had the fourth largest army on Earth and lost the war in just 100 hours. On the 2nd of August, 1990, the world awoke to a nightmare playing out in real time. In the dead of night, Iraqi armored columns rolled across the Kuwaiti desert like a tidal wave of steel. Helicopters filled with elite Republican Guard commandos descended on Kuwait City. Within hours, the oil-rich monarchy was overrun, its royal family in exile. Its treasury emptied, Saddam Hussein, dictator of Iraq, survivor of the brutal Iran-Iraq war, had made his move. But within 6 months, that same army would be in tatters, buried under a rain of cruise missiles, napalm, and a relentless multinational force, the likes of which the Middle East had never seen. A war that started with thunderous confidence would end in a retreat so chaotic that the desert highway to Baghdad would be littered with the twisted remains of fleeing vehicles and corpses. So how did it happen? How did Saddam's surprise triumph turn into a geopolitical catastrophe? And how did his reckless bet to seize Kuwait and challenge the world unite enemies from every corner of the globe, from Washington to Moscow to Riyadh, into a single, unstoppable war machine? The answers lie not in battlefield blunders alone, but in the deep anxieties of a regime stretched thin, in oil prices and old debts, in ancient rivalries and modern paranoia, and in a dictator's dream of glory turning, moment by moment, into ash. But to understand the Gulf War, we must first understand the wounds still bleeding from the war that came before, a war that exhausted a nation and radicalized its ruler. In 1988, Iraq emerged from the Iran-Iraq War, broken but not bowed. For 8 years, Saddam's forces had thrown everything they had against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And for what? Over 600,000 Iraqi casualties, trillions of dinars burned, a war that achieved virtually no gains. Iran was battered, but not beaten. Iraq was bloodied and bankrupt. With the ceasefire signed, Saddam faced a terrible truth. The price of his failed gamble was $80 billion in debt, much of it owed to Gulf neighbors like Kuwait. It would take another $230 billion to rebuild the bombed cities and poisoned marshlands of southern Iraq. And yet Saddam couldn't slow down. His military consumed 40% of Iraq's GDP. His economy limped under the weight of sanctions, bloated subsidies, and falling oil revenues. The streets of Baghdad buzzed with anger. Unemployment was soaring. And in the Shiite south, unrest simmered beneath the surface. But Saddam saw enemies not only in Tehran or Washington, but inside his own borders. Throughout the 1980s, his regime had launched brutal campaigns against internal minorities. The Shia, the Kurds, especially the Faili Kurds, faced arrests, deportations, and chemical weapons. Saddam's grip on power relied on both fear and money. And the money was running out. Oil was Iraq's lifeline, and Kuwait, in Saddam's eyes, was slitting that lifeline open. The small but wealthy emirate was accused of overproducing oil, depressing prices to protect its own wealth while bleeding Iraq dry. To make matters worse, Kuwait still held $10 billion of Iraqi wartime debt and showed no interest in forgiving it. In early 1990, Saddam began pressing for what he saw as just compensation. In meetings with Jordan and Egypt, he pushed Gulf states for $30 billion in reparations for defending them against Iran. At the same time, he moved tanks and troops to the Kuwaiti border, not yet to strike, but to signal. The signal was clear. For every single dollar drop in the price of oil, we lose $1 billion per year. Saddam thundered at an Arab summit in May. War is fought with soldiers, but it is also done by economic means. This is a kind of war against Iraq. The Emir of Kuwait dismissed the threats as absurd, but Saddam wasn't bluffing. By mid-July, 100,000 Iraqi troops and 300 tanks stood poised on the Kuwaiti border. Arab leaders hoped the crisis would pass. The United States reaffirmed its support for Gulf sovereignty, but believed the standoff was saber-rattling, not real war. They were wrong. At 2 a.m. on the 2nd of August, 1990, the order came down. Columns of Iraqi tanks T-72S and BMPs roared over the border. Commandos landed by helicopter near key installations. Resistance was light. The Kuwaiti military, unprepared and overwhelmed, collapsed in hours. By the end of the day, Saddam had seized the capital and looted $2 billion from the central bank. 48 hours later, Kuwait was gone, but Saddam had underestimated the world's reaction. The invasion shocked not just Washington and London, but Cairo, Riyadh, even Moscow. In the Cold War's waning twilight, old adversaries found themselves united against him. For the first time since the Korean War, the UN Security Council, including the USSR and China, unanimously condemned Iraq and demanded withdrawal. But Saddam stood firm. He believed the West would bluster but not act. That Arab solidarity would hold. That the Americans lacked the stomach for another war in the desert. He was wrong on all counts. On the 6th of August, just 4 days after the invasion, the United Nations imposed a full trade embargo on Iraq. It was a crushing blow. Oil made up 90% of Iraq's national income. The embargo threatened not just Saddam's regime, but the survival of his state. At the same time, Saudi Arabia, fearing it might be next, made a historic decision. King Fahd invited American troops to deploy on Saudi soil. It was the first time in modern history that foreign forces would be stationed in the kingdom, a moment that would ripple across the Islamic world, shaping future resentments and revolts. But in that moment, the Saudis were terrified. Saddam's army stood just across the border, and his appetite, it seemed, was far from sated. On the 8th of August, President George H.W. Bush addressed the American people. At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division and key units of the Air Force are arriving in Saudi Arabia. Our objectives are clear: the unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait and the restoration of its legitimate government. Operation Desert Shield had begun. Soon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, the United Kingdom, France, and dozens of other nations joined the growing coalition. Even the Soviet Union, once an arms supplier to Iraq, cut ties with Saddam. The global response was as broad as it was swift. 42 countries pledged support. From the skies of Europe came fighter jets. From the deserts of Egypt came armored brigades. From the docks of America came carriers, tanks, missiles, and men. Within weeks, the Saudi ports were overwhelmed, containers stacked sky high, convoys clogging newly built highways. Over 150,000 American troops deployed in the first phase. Uniforms, ammunition, food, and medical equipment arrived in what would become the largest military airlift since World War II. And yet, war was not inevitable. President Bush insisted on diplomacy, giving Saddam time to withdraw. But Saddam, perhaps emboldened by past American hesitation in the region, remained defiant. He played dangerous games. To fracture the coalition, he took hundreds of foreign nationals hostage. He stationed them at military sites, using them as human shields. He accused the U.S. of serving Israeli interests. And yet, ironically, Israel remained out of the conflict. deliberately silent to keep Arab states inside the coalition. Meanwhile, horrific stories emerged from occupied Kuwait: looting, executions, systematic targeting of Kuwaitis. One refugee described it plainly. They came to our house. They took our passports, our IDs, everything that made us Kuwaiti. Later, some of these accounts, like the infamous incubator baby testimony, would be exposed as propaganda, coordinated by a Kuwaiti public relations firm in the West. But for the moment, the moral justification for war had taken root. By autumn, Saddam's forces began constructing massive defenses, trenches, minefields, oil-filled moats. His elite Republican Guard Corps waited in reserve. He believed that the memory of Vietnam still haunted Washington, that Americans wouldn't sacrifice lives in a protracted desert war. He misjudged again. On the 29th of November, 1990, the UN gave Saddam an ultimatum: withdraw from Kuwait by the 15th of January, 1991, or face war. As the deadline approached, American Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney made the stakes clear. It doesn't mean partial withdrawal. It doesn't mean he gets to keep 10, 20, or 30% of what he stole. It means full, complete, and total withdrawal, or we strike. Saddam remained silent. He had made his decision. At 3:00 a.m. on the 17th of January, 1991, with the deadline passed, Operation Desert Storm began. The skies above Iraq turned to fire. In the first 24 hours alone, over 1,300 coalition sorties targeted Iraqi radar sites, airfields, command centers, and missile launchers. Apache helicopters launched precision strikes. Stealth bombers dropped laser-guided munitions. Cruise missiles struck the heart of Baghdad. Saddam's air defenses, a dense network of bunkers, anti-aircraft guns, and radar-guided SAMs, were overwhelmed. Iraqi fighter jets scrambled, only to be destroyed or chased from the skies. Within 3 days, coalition forces controlled the air. Lieutenant Colonel Waldo B. Cummings, Jr. recalled his first mission. It was the biggest light show I had ever seen. Red and orange tracers streaked the sky below. Missiles launched blindly. We dove at a 30-degree angle toward our target, flames already licking the horizon. And yet, for Iraqi soldiers dug into the trenches of southern Kuwait, information was scarce and morale was low. One conscript wrote, "They say Baghdad is destroyed. Others say it's not. All the news is lies. The truth is lost." Saddam responded by unleashing a different kind of weapon. He ordered his forces to set demolition charges at hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells. When they ignited, massive black clouds covered the desert. Day turned to night. The thick smoke, lit by napalm, burned into the lungs of soldiers and civilians alike. Then came the Scud missiles, launched from deep inside Iraq. These weapons targeted Saudi and Israeli cities, not to destroy, but to divide. Saddam's goal was clear: draw Israel into the war, provoque a response, and fracture the coalition. It nearly worked. But Israel, under American pressure and with the promise of Patriot missile defense systems, held its fire. Coalition commanders responded with elite strike teams, British SAS and American Delta Force sent deep into Iraq to hunt the mobile Scud launchers. Slowly, the threat diminished. On the 29th of January, Saddam made one last gamble. His troops crossed the border and briefly occupied the Saudi town of Khafji, but the move backfired. Coalition air power rained destruction. Within hours, the Iraqis were driven back. The battle, though small, reinforced a growing truth. Coalition technology and coordination were overwhelming Iraqi numbers and fortifications. Then, in the weeks that followed, the real hammer fell. Between the 24th of January and the 23rd of February, over 40, zero airstrikes pulverized Iraqi infrastructure. Command centers, fuel depots, electric grids, ammunition dumps, communication nodes, entire sections of the battlefield kill boxes were designated for relentless bombing. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers deserted. By the time the ground invasion was ready, Saddam's front lines were hollowed out, demoralized, and blind. At dawn on the 24th of February, 500,000 coalition troops surged forward. The plan? A massive left hook to outflank the Iraqi army, cut off its escape routes, and encircle Kuwait. In the west, French and American airborne divisions advanced with lightning speed. The 101st Airborne moved 270 kilometers into Iraq by helicopter, the deepest air assault in military history. Iraqi forces, expecting a southern attack, were caught entirely off guard. In the center, British and American tanks plowed through minefields and trenches. Bulldozers pushed berms aside. Resistance collapsed. On the eastern flank, U.S. Marines fought through fire and smoke to seize airfields and key positions. One of the fiercest battles came on the 26th of February. Near Highway 8, American forces clashed with Saddam's elite Republican Guard in thick smoke and close quarters. In one engagement, 13M1 A1 Abrams tanks destroyed 30 Iraqi tanks in just 90 seconds without a single American loss. By the 26th of February, 1991, Saddam Hussein's army was disintegrating. 24 of his divisions had been shattered. His Republican Guard, once the pride of the regime, was in full retreat. The skies above Iraq and Kuwait belonged to the coalition, and every vehicle fleeing north was a target. That night, under cover of darkness and the thick black smoke of burning oil fields, thousands of Iraqi soldiers attempted to escape via Highway 80, the main road from Kuwait City to Basra. What followed would be remembered as one of the most controversial images of the war. Coalition aircraft, spotting the long convoy of military and civilian vehicles, opened fire. For hours, A-10 Warthogs and F-15E Strike Eagles strafed the highway, turning cars, trucks, and armored vehicles into twisted metal. The scene became known as the Highway of Death. Journalists arriving the next day saw blackened corpses, destroyed tanks, and looted Kuwaiti goods strewn across the desert. Some soldiers had clearly abandoned their posts before the bombing began. Others had not been so lucky. In the west, another highway of death unfolded on Highway 8, where Iraqi forces trying to reposition were caught and annihilated by airstrikes. Inside Kuwait City, coalition ground forces led by Saudi, Kuwait, and American units moved swiftly. The city had been looted, its infrastructure devastated, but the Iraqi occupiers were gone. The Emir of Kuwait was restored to power. The liberation was complete. And yet, Saddam still stood. His army has suffered catastrophic losses. Estimates vary. Between 20,000 to 50,000 Iraqi troops killed, up to 175,000 captured, and tens of thousands wounded. The coalition? Only 292 killed, of which nearly half were from friendly fire or accidents. It was, by any metric, one of the most lopsided victories in modern military history. But it was not the end. On the 28th of February, after exactly 100 hours of ground operations, President George H. W. Bush announced a ceasefire. Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Tonight, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations. For Bush and his advisors, the mission had been clear: eject Iraq from Kuwait, not march to Baghdad. But as the dust settled, new fires were already burning. In southern Iraq, especially in the city of Basra, Shiite soldiers returning from the front turned their weapons on Saddam's regime. Angry, disillusioned, and sensing weakness, they stormed government buildings, police stations, and Ba'ath Party offices. The uprising spread quickly. In the north, Kurdish fighters long oppressed by Baghdad also rose in revolt. Supported by defecting soldiers, they captured major cities like Kirkuk and Dohuk. For a moment, it seemed Saddam's regime was on the brink of collapse. Encouraged by American broadcasts and Voice of America signals, many believed the United States would back their revolutions. They were wrong. The Bush administration and many coalition partners feared the disintegration of Iraq more than they feared Saddam. A fractured Iraq could empower Iran, destabilize Turkey, and unravel the fragile coalition that had just won the war. So the United States watched. Some humanitarian aid was sent. Limited no-fly zones were established over the north and south. But on the ground, Saddam's tanks and helicopter gunships, which had been spared in the ceasefire, crushed the rebellions. By early April, it was over. Entire towns were razed. Tens of thousands of rebels and civilians were executed. Allegations of chemical weapon use surfaced. The same military machine that had just fled Kuwait was now turned inward and brutal. One Kurdish fighter, Othman Mahmoud, would later say, "We were told, rise up and rid yourself of Saddam." And we did. But then they looked away. The price of that decision would echo into the decades that followed. On paper, the first Gulf War was a perfect military operation. The objectives were achieved with speed and precision. A sovereign nation was liberated. A dangerous dictator was humbled. A grand coalition spanning continents and ideologies had stood together with remarkable unity. But beneath the triumphant headlines, there were cracks. For Iraq, the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. An economy in ruins. Sanctions that would strangle the nation for another decade. And a humiliated population, left under the boot of a dictator, now more paranoid than ever. Inside the United States, another story was beginning to unfold. Veterans returned home victorious, but many carried invisible wounds. Soon, tens of thousands would report symptoms of what became known as Gulf War syndrome: chronic fatigue, memory loss, neurological issues. Theories range from exposure to chemical agents, to vaccines, to the toxic smoke of oil fires. Over 250,000 U.S. veterans, nearly one-third of the entire combat force, reported such symptoms. The war had ended in 1991. But for them, something never truly stopped. And for Saddam Hussein, defeat only hardened his resolve. His regime, bloodied but unbroken, would face new rebellions, new sanctions, and ultimately, new wars. But for now, he remained in power. The oil wells would be capped, the cities rebuilt, but Iraq and the world had changed. The Cold War was ending. The Soviet Union was collapsing. And into that vacuum of global order came a new doctrine, one where America's military might would shape the future. The Gulf War was just the beginning. Saddam's gamble had redrawn the lines of power in the Middle East. And even in defeat, his shadow would linger across the decade. Because wars do not always end where the maps say they do. And sometimes, 100 hours can change the world. If stories like this help you see history not as dates and battles, but as decisions, miscalculations, and lives forever altered, consider joining us here at Legacy Files. We dive deeper than textbooks dare, and we ask the questions left behind in silence. Subscribe for more history that doesn't just inform, but resonates, because the past isn't gone, it's just waiting to be understood